Spring, 1945. The rain had stopped only minutes earlier, and the railway yard outside Rams still looked half drowned in mud. The ground gave under every step, as if the war had softened even the earth itself. Anna Luderbach stood in line with nearly 200 other women beside a row of boxcars. Their uniforms were damp, their collars dark with rain, and their faces carried the exhausted look of people who had been living too long under bad news. They had already been searched once that morning. Pockets were turned out, bags were opened, blankets were shaken, and any small scrap of privacy was taken away with military efficiency. Anna kept her left hand closed at her side. Inside that fist was the one thing she had refused to surrender so far, a plain gold wedding ring that had become more than an ornament after years of war. It had been on her finger through the bombings in Bremen, through the hunger winters, through the nights in cellars when the city above seemed to collapse one block at a time. She had kept it on after the telegram arrived saying her husband had died somewhere in Russia. His body never recovered. The ring was all that remained of that life. It was not valuable in the way soldiers meant when they spoke of valuables, but to Anna it was proof that she had once been a wife, that someone had once chosen her, and that the war had not erased everything. An American sergeant moved slowly down the line with an interpreter at his side. He was broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, and carried himself with the kind of calm that came from men who trusted procedures more than moods. When he stopped in front of the women, he did not shout. He simply gave the order, and the interpreter translated it into German with the flat patience of a man who had repeated the same words all morning. All jewelry must be removed. Rings, watches, necklaces, bracelets. Place them in your hand. For a moment, no one moved. Anna felt the silence tighten around the line. It was not the silence of surrender, but the silence of people deciding whether this would be another theft, another humiliation, another lie delivered in uniform. Around her, women began to react in small private ways. One bent her head and stared at the ground. Another pressed her palm over the place where a ring had been. A younger girl near the end of the line started to cry without making a sound. Anna watched the sergeant and tried to read him. He did not look cruel. That was what unsettled her most. Men who looked cruel were easier to understand than men who looked controlled. She had learned over the long years of war that every system promised order at the moment it wanted obedience. That was why her hand stayed closed. That was why she did not yet trust the voice speaking to her through the interpreter. Then the sergeant spoke again, and the line began to move. Not quickly, not yet, but enough to make Anna understand that the moment she had been avoiding was now already on top of her. Immediate disruption. The interpreter repeated the order, and this time the words landed harder because they had already been understood. Jewelry, rings, watches. Everything that could be hidden, worn, or kept close to the body had to be placed in the hand and surrendered for processing. Anna looked down at her closed fist and felt the ring press into her skin. It was a small object, but it had taken on the weight of something far larger, the last piece of a life that had survived the collapse of everything else by staying attached to her finger. A guard carried a wooden crate to the front of the line. Another man opened a ledger and waited with a pencil held ready, as if what mattered most was not the taking but the recording. The sergeant said something brief, and the interpreter translated it into German with the same flat discipline as before. The property would be catalogued. Each item would receive a number. Each woman would receive a receipt. It was the kind of language that sounded harmless, until it was attached to something you could not afford to lose. Anna felt the first real crack of fear then, not because the Americans were shouting or rough, but because they were organized. Men who stole recklessly could be resisted in the imagination. Men who carried ledgers and numbers were harder to fight because they made themselves sound lawful. Beside her, an older woman muttered that they would never see their things again. Someone farther down the line said the same thing in a whisper. The rumor moved through the group quickly, not because it was new, but because it gave shape to what everyone was already afraid of. Anna kept looking at the ring. It was still on her hand, still warm from her skin, still a private thing in a public place. Yet the order had changed its meaning at once, because now the ring was not simply hers. It was something the system had noticed. She thought of Carl again, of the day he had slipped it onto her finger in a church that smelled faintly of wax and wet stone. He had smiled in that quiet way of his and told her it was not grand, but it had survived long enough to matter. That thought made her throat tighten. The war had already taken his body, his grave, and the future they had once imagined. If this line of Americans took the ring as well, then what exactly would remain of him in the world she had left? The sergeant stepped forward and signaled the first woman to begin. The line shifted by one body. Anna did not move, but she felt the pressure of the moment change around her, as if the story had just crossed a point from which it could not easily turn back. In the wreckage of World War II, a simple gold ring could carry the weight of an entire lifetime. If you stood in Anna's shoes, would you surrender your final memory, or would you find a way to resist? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. To ensure you don't miss the final chapter of her journey, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your engagement directly supports our growth. Anna Lutherbach was 30 years old, and she had spent most of the war doing the kind of work that made her notice details other people ignored. Before everything collapsed, she had been a clerk in a supply office in Bremen, the sort of person who knew how to track lists, count inventory, and keep records neat enough that mistakes became visible at a glance. That habit had not left her. Even now, standing in the mud with a line of other prisoners around her, she was noticing boots, hands, ledgers, and the way the American sergeant held himself like a man who expected the world to function in sequence. It was that habit of mind that made her distrust the moment more than the men in it. She had seen systems before, German systems, wartime systems, administrative systems. They all claimed precision at the start, and all of them, in one way or another, had ended in confusion, fear, and disappearance. In her left hand was the ring, and the ring was not only a wedding band anymore. It had become a kind of private archive, a small circle of gold that held the memory of her husband, her marriage, and the life that had existed before the uniforms, ration cards, and air raid sirens. Carl had given it to her in 1939, in a church that smelled of wax and rain, and he had done it with the awkward seriousness of a man who understood that promises mattered most when the world was already beginning to break. He had been a school teacher, quiet and thoughtful, the kind of man who treated ordinary things with respect. He died in Russia 2 years later, and after that, the ring became something she wore not for beauty, but for continuity. It was the last object in her possession that had survived the war without being transformed into evidence of loss. That was why the order unsettled her so deeply. It was not just that they were being told to surrender jewelry. It was that the Americans had named the ring as something measurable, taggable, movable, something that belonged in a system larger than the private grief she had wrapped around it. Anna knew better than to assume kindness from uniforms. She had watched bureaucracy turn cold before, and she had learned that the language of order often came wrapped around the same old danger. What made this moment worse was that the Americans did not look like men preparing to steal. They looked like men preparing to keep records. The difference mattered. Theft could be fought in the mind. Record-keeping was harder to resist because it carried the appearance of law. And law, even when it failed, always asked to be believed before it asked to be obeyed. A woman near the front of the line whispered that they would never get their things back. Another answered that all camps said the same thing. Anna did not speak, but she listened, because fear was moving through the line faster than the order had. The ring pressed against her palm, warm from her skin, and she felt the first real edge of the problem. If the Americans were wrong, then this would be another theft in a war full of them. If they were right, then she would have to admit that her fear had been preparing her for a failure that might not come. She did not know which possibility she hated more. Anna had not always thought of the ring as grief. In the beginning, it had simply been a wedding band, the sort of thing a woman wore because marriage was still a fact worth marking, even if the world around it was already shifting toward harder shapes. Carl had put it on her finger in the spring of 1939, and for a while the memory of that moment had been enough. He had worked as a school teacher before the war took him away. He was quiet in company, careful with his words, and more likely to notice a damaged book than a broken chair, which was part of why Anna had trusted him so completely. He made ordinary things feel stable, and in a time that would later prove how little stability remained, that had mattered more than she understood then. They had married in a small church near Bremen, with only a few friends present, and no sense that history was already leaning over them. The ring had belonged to Carl's mother, and he had said, almost apologetically, that it was not impressive. Then he added that it had survived long enough to mean something, and she had laughed because it sounded like the kind of remark a teacher would make, half practical and half tender. When the war began, that ring turned into a habit. Anna wore it through ration lines, through blackout curtains, through nights when the city trembled under bombs so close they rattled cups in kitchen cupboards. She wore it when the first men from Bremen stopped coming home, when letters grew irregular, and when every small delay started to feel like a warning. Then the telegram came from Russia. It was brief, as wartime telegrams always were, and the brevity made it worse. Carl had been killed near Leningrad, the message said, and his body had not been recovered. There was no place to visit, no grave to stand beside, no physical proof except the paper in her hand and the ring on her finger. After that, the ring changed its meaning completely. It was no longer a mark of marriage in the ordinary sense. It became the only object that still carried Carl's presence in a world that had become increasingly full of absence, and Anna kept it on because taking it off would have felt like agreeing that he had been erased. That was the real reason the American order struck her so hard. The ring was not valuable because of the gold. It was valuable because it had survived every earlier attempt by war to turn memory into ash. To hand it over now felt less like surrendering property than surrendering the last witness to a life that had once been whole. The American sergeant did not know any of that. He saw a prisoner, a piece of jewelry, and a rule that had to be carried out in an orderly way. That distance made him more frightening, not less, because it meant the thing Anna feared most was not personal malice, but institutional indifference. She understood institutions. She had worked inside them. She knew how a supply office could make catastrophe look efficient, how numbers could hide damage, and how a signature could make a decision feel clean even when it had hurt someone badly. That was why the scene in front of her unsettled her more than any shouted threat could have done. The men at the front of the line began to move equipment into place. A wooden crate was set near the sergeant's feet. A ledger was opened on a folding table. Another soldier stood beside a satchel full of cloth bags and wire tags, and everything about the arrangement suggested that this was not a theft done in haste, but a process that had been planned in advance. The interpreter explained each step with the same detached clarity. Each item would be listed. Each name would be matched to a number. Each prisoner would receive a receipt. The language was calm and exact, which only made Anna more aware of the tension in her own hands. A woman ahead of her stepped forward with a bracelet. The sergeant examined it briefly, wrote in the ledger, and attached a numbered tag to the item. Then he placed it in a cloth bag and handed her a card with the same number written on it. The exchange took less than a minute, yet Anna watched as if the entire future of the war had narrowed down into that small motion. That was when she understood the true danger of the moment. The ring was no longer protected by being hidden. It had entered the attention of the system. It could be weighed, numbered, stored, and lost in ways that no longer depended on brute force alone. Anna looked at the line ahead of her and felt the pace of time change. The process was slow, but each woman who stepped forward made her own turn more certain. What had been a distant threat was now becoming a sequence, and sequences had a way of closing around people. She kept her hand closed and waited, already knowing that the next few minutes would decide whether the ring remained a private memory or became an item in a ledger. The women around Anna were starting to speak in the low, guarded tone people used when they wanted to sound brave without fully believing it. One said the Americans would keep whatever they took, because armies always found a way to make language useful to themselves. Another said the receipts were only paper, and paper meant nothing once a convoy had moved on. Anna listened without arguing. She had no proof that they were wrong, and no comfort strong enough to silence the old instinct that told her loss was usually permanent. The war had trained everyone to expect disappearance, and the simplest explanation still felt like the safest one. Lotta, who stood just behind her in line, leaned forward and spoke quietly enough that only Anna could hear. She said she had seen men in camps promise order before, and those promises had usually been another way of keeping people calm while things vanished in the background. Her voice was flat, but there was fear in it all the same. "You think they will return it?" Lotta asked. Anna did not answer at once. The question was too plain, and that made it harder to dismiss. Lotta went on anyway, saying that a receipt could be lost, a number could be misread, and a box could be opened by any man with enough access and not enough conscience. She was not trying to persuade Anna of anything. She was only saying out loud the shape of the danger everyone had already felt. That was what made the doubt spread so easily. It was not dramatic. It was practical. A thing could be tagged and still disappear. A system could be orderly and still fail the people inside it. Anna understood that kind of fear too well. She had lived through enough wartime paperwork to know that clean records did not always mean clean hands, and that the people who spoke most confidently about security were often the first to excuse a mistake when one occurred. Ahead of her, another woman was called up to the table. She surrendered a necklace with a small cross hanging from it, and the sergeant wrote down the details with complete attention. He checked the number twice before sealing the item in a cloth bag. The woman stared at the receipt as if she expected it to vanish in her hand. Then she stepped back into line without speaking, and Anna saw something change in her expression. Not relief exactly. Not yet. But the first trace of uncertainty giving way to the possibility that the system might really be doing what it claimed. The detail mattered because it was so small. No dramatic promise, no speech about honor, only a number written down correctly and a tag fastened without hesitation. Yet that was enough to create the first crack in the wall of fear. Anna felt it too. Not trust, not even hope. Just the faint possibility that the Americans were not improvising, that the order in front of her was not theater, and that the ring might survive the process after all. It was an uneasy thought, and that was what gave it force. If the system was real, then she had spent all this time preparing for a theft that might never come. If it was not, then the disappointment would be worse because it would arrive disguised as procedure. The line moved again, one woman at a time, and Anna could feel the balance inside her shifting by degrees. Fear was still there, but now it had company, and the new feeling beside it was more dangerous because it kept asking to be believed. By June, the war in Europe had already changed shape. The newspapers called it over, but in camps like this, endings arrived more slowly than headlines, and meant less at first than they were supposed to. The women heard the news in fragments, passed from barracks to barracks and from guard to guard, until it became impossible to ignore. Some wept. Some sat very still. Anna felt neither at first, only a strange emptiness that seemed to belong to exhaustion rather than peace. The camp itself had begun to feel different as well. The guards were still there, the fences were still there, and the routines had not vanished, but the pressure of war had loosened enough to let other questions rise up in its place. Anna started to understand that the ring was no longer only about Carl. It had become a test of whether anything personal could survive inside a world governed by process, numbers, and official memory. If the Americans kept their word, then the ring would prove that a system could outlast fear without becoming cruel. If they did not, then the war would have taken one more thing from her, even after the fighting had ended. That possibility made the object larger. It was no longer only a wedding band, no longer only a keepsake, and no longer only a private grief she could touch with her thumb when no one was looking. It had become a measure of trust. A small worn circle of gold had somehow turned into the place where history, law, and memory all met, and Anna could feel that meeting point drawing closer with every day that passed. She still did not know whether to hope. Hope felt dangerous because it invited disappointment, but the longer the war stayed over without giving her an answer, the more the ring seemed to stand in for the question itself. Around her, the women were beginning to think about home, release, return, and everything that would have to be rebuilt. Anna listened to them, but her attention kept returning to the same thought. If a government could lose cities, families, and whole countries, could it still be trusted to keep one small band of gold safe? That question, more than the ring itself, had become the center of her waiting. In July, Anna was called to the property office with no explanation beyond routine verification. She already knew the building by smell, paper, ink, metal, and the cool dryness of a room where everything had a place and every place had a number. The warrant officer was there, along with the German translator and one of the Red Cross inspectors. The same shelves lined the walls, and the same boxes sat in their numbered rows. But now the whole room felt charged with the quiet seriousness of a courtroom. "Box 384, the translator said. The warrant officer moved without hesitation. He found the shelf, withdrew the box, and set it on the table as if he were handing back with the same care he had used before and placed it in the cloth bag. The bag went back into the box, and the box returned to the shelf. But Anna no longer felt the same helplessness watching it. The system had become visible now, not as a threat, but as a structure with rules that could actually be tested and followed. Part of her had wanted to believe that from the beginning. Another part had refused to risk it. Now both parts had been answered, and neither of them felt foolish for having existed. A few weeks later, Anna received a letter from her mother in Bremen. The paper was thin, the handwriting smaller than before, and the envelope looked as if it had traveled through too many hands to arrive whole. Her mother wrote that the city was still broken, but no longer silent. Children were in the streets again. Markets had reopened in small ways. Roofs were being repaired one board at a time. Then, in the middle of the letter, came a sentence that made Anna stop reading. Carl's old watch had been stolen from the cellar during the shortages. The loss was not a surprise. That was what made it painful. Home had not protected memory any better than war had. Her mother ended with a line Anna would not forget. She said she was glad the ring had been safe because it meant someone had kept a promise when it would have been easier not to. Anna folded the letter and sat for a long time with it in her lap. Around her, the camp had grown quieter than it once had been, and the evening light outside the barracks looked almost gentle. Lotta asked what the letter said, but Anna only smiled faintly, something that mattered not because it was valuable, but because the rules attached to it had to mean something. He opened it. The cloth bag was still sealed. The tag was still in place. Anna felt her breathing tighten before the ring even appeared. When the ring came out, it looked smaller than memory and more ordinary than fear had allowed. But it was there, gold, worn smooth, still marked inside with Carl's initials and the date of their wedding. The Red Cross inspector read the description aloud from the receipt. The tag number matched. The engraving matched. The record matched the object exactly, down to the scratches Anna remembered from years of wear. For a moment, she could not speak. Not because she was surprised the ring existed, but because the existence of it in that room meant the system had held through rain, distance, transport, and time. "You may hold it," the inspector said. Anna reached out with both hands. The ring was cool against her skin, familiar in a way that made her throat tighten. It was not simply a band of gold anymore, and the return of it did not erase the years that had come between the wedding and this room, but it restored something she had thought war had made impossible. She slipped it onto her finger. It fit exactly. The feeling that came over her was not joy in any simple sense. It was deeper, quieter, and more disciplined than that, as if a part of her body had been waiting years for proof that the world still contained reliable things. The officer took the ring and answered. They gave it back. Lotta did not argue this time. She just nodded, and in that small silence, Anna could feel the whole weight of the story settle into place. The ring was still only a ring, but now it carried something more than grief. It carried proof that order could survive pressure, that duty could mean something, and that a promise kept by strangers could still feel like a kind of honor. Anna sat by the window a little longer and turned the receipt once in her fingers before putting it away. Outside, the camp lights came on one by one, steady and calm, as if the world itself had finally decided to keep watch.